That night, I heard my wife whisper in the kitchen, "In Asheville. No one knows he's still alive." I froze behind the door, not because I feared betrayal, but because I had just heard the date of my own death, spoken by the woman who once called me her whole life. 45 years of marriage, a house I built with my own hands, and within a few sentences I realized I had been declared dead by a lie. People can lie to the world, but only the truly cold-hearted dare to bury someone alive to start a new life. And that night, I was no longer an ordinary carpenter. I was a dead man searching for his honor. If you've ever been betrayed so deeply that you no longer recognized yourself in your own story, stay until the end. Because this isn't just about revenge. It's about how a man pronounced dead by deceit came back to life through truth. Leave a single dot if you believe justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to stand up in the silence. That evening, Laurel Creek Lake was so still it felt as if it were holding its breath. Our wooden house sat on the slope overlooking the moonlit water. I had set the dinner table myself for our 45th anniversary. White cloth, 2 crystal glasses, a vase of wildflowers, and a small candle I carved from rosewood. The house smelled of warm timber, pine resin, and wine. Martha sat across from me in a pale green dress, her face as gentle as ever, though her eyes were unusually calm. We spoke of Peter, of Rachel, of the garden behind the house, then fell silent. It had been a long time since a meal between us was that quiet. When I reached for the wine, Martha laid her hand on the table and said softly, "Robert, I want to ask you something." I looked at her. She bit her lip and continued, "I want to take a few months apart, to find my inspiration again." The words landed between us, light as air, yet leaving a deep crack. I didn't ask why, nor did I get angry. At my age, I know silence is sometimes the only way to keep one's dignity. I simply nodded, poured more wine, and said quietly, "If you need that, I respect it." We finished the venison in silence. The candle wax scent filled the room. When she stood to clear the plates, I caught a strange perfume on her wrist, not the lavender she'd worn for years. I thought maybe someone had given it to her and let it go. After Martha went upstairs, I cleaned the table, turned off the lights, and went to my workshop beside the house. The wind whispered through the boards, crickets chirped on the porch, and I felt an emptiness inside. 45 years of marriage, countless storms weathered together, I thought nothing could unsettle me anymore. But that night felt different, as if a nail had just been driven deep into wood where no one could see. Near midnight, I heard Martha in the kitchen. Light spilled through the crack of the door, her shadow stretching across the wall. I almost went down to ask, but stopped when I heard her voice murmuring on the phone. She spoke softly, but every word was clear. "In Asheville, no one knows he's still alive." I froze. Those words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I thought I misheard, until she repeated, "Yes, don't worry, I'll come Thursday." I stood there, barely breathing. My wife of nearly half a century had just told someone that I was dead. In the house I built on the night of our anniversary, I had heard the death sentence of my own life. I went back to my study and turned on the desk lamp. The yellow light fell over my calloused hands. I opened my laptop, logged into the bank account I checked every month. Scrolling through the transactions, everything seemed normal, until my eyes stopped at one line, "Asheville Inn, room deposit." The payment date was last week. Asheville, more than 40 miles away, was where Martha used to attend teacher conferences, but she hadn't mentioned any trip lately. I opened the details. Name, check-in date, all matched the weekend she said she had a school meeting. I didn't want to believe it, but numbers don't lie. Each time the cursor moved across the screen, it felt like a splinter driving into my chest. I took a screenshot and saved a copy. Downstairs, Martha's voice still floated faintly, soft, tender, comforting someone. Then silence, only the wind through the door crack. The candle on the table must have burned out. leaving only thin smoke curling around cold crystal glasses. I sat for a long time. One sentence kept echoing in my head, sharp as a saw cutting through wood. I never thought I'd hear my wife say that I was dead. I looked around the room, the old wedding photo, the silver cross she'd given me on our wedding day, the woodworking journal open on the table. Everything I had believed for 45 years had become evidence of misplaced faith. I closed the notebook, wrote one small line on the edge of the page. Asheville Inn, check. Then I turned off the light. In the dark, I heard the clock tick, steady, cold, real. Perhaps from that night on, I had to learn how to live like a man already dead, at least in the story my wife was telling somewhere. And from that same night, I began to search for the real reason behind those 4 words. He's still alive. I still remember that autumn morning in 1976. Back then, I was just an apprentice carpenter in a small workshop in the western mountains of North Carolina. I made a living carving door frames and stair rails for homes around Laurel Creek. My hands were still young, not yet thick with the scent of pine resin, but I already loved the sound of a saw more than any music in the world. Each morning, before the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Range, I would hear the wood crack softly beneath the plane, like the heartbeat of someone learning to grow. That was the year I met Martha, one quiet afternoon. She had just graduated from the teaching college in Raleigh and had been assigned as the new elementary school teacher in town. The bus dropped her off right as I was unloading lumber for a client. The autumn wind carried the smell of damp soil and the rustle of dry leaves. She stepped down, holding her bag, her dark brown hair brushing her shoulders, her face still carrying the gentleness of youth. I don't know how long I stared, but I remember her turning, smiling briefly, then walking toward the small road leading to the school. Later, I often stopped by the school to fix broken desks, build bookshelves, or simply to have an excuse to stand outside the fence and watch her teach. Every time she spoke, her voice flowed like water over stone. One day, she handed me a small book and said, "Mr. Carpenter, this one has an article about how the Japanese respect wood, as if it had a soul. You should read it." I smiled. All I know is which wood bends and which wood holds. The soul part, I suppose you'd understand that better than I do. She replied, "If you know how to listen, every grain of wood tells you something about people." From that day, we grew close. I fixed furniture for the school. She brought me pastries to the shop. Our first home was built by our own hands. The land lay on a slope overlooking Laurel Creek Lake, the same place where I now live alone. At first, it was just a small cabin, 1 bedroom, 1 kitchen, a tin roof. I cut each board, she painted, laughing as we worked through the day. Sometimes, when rain blew in, we'd huddle together in a corner, waiting for the sky to clear. When the house was done, I opened a small shop beside it and hung a sign that read, "Hensley Woodcraft." She used to joke, "If there ever comes a day you stop loving me, at least keep loving the smell of wood. It's proof you still know how to keep a promise." I remember answering, "To me, wood and promises are the same. Once bent the wrong way, they can only be burned, never fixed." Martha laughed, her eyes glowing through the haze of pine smoke. That line became something I repeated to every apprentice for years. Once a piece of wood is bent wrong, it can only be burned, not fixed. Then Peter was born, and later, Rachel. We lived simply, mornings in the workshop, afternoons at her school, evenings around the dinner table. On winter nights, the saw still hummed in the shop, yellow light spilling through the windows, while Martha sat sewing clothes for the children. Life was simple, peaceful, and I truly believed we would grow old together, like 2 pieces of wood lying side by side within the same tree. But peace, like wood, always carries hidden cracks. Back to the present, after that 45th anniversary night, an unease grew inside me. The words, "In Asheville, no one knows he's still alive," wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to convince myself I'd misheard, that it was just a private conversation between women, but the logic of a craftsman who measures to the millimeter wouldn't let me ignore it. A few days later, Martha said she had to go to Asheville again for a teachers' conference. I nodded, saying nothing. As she packed, I quietly helped her close the suitcase, just like every other time. But once she left, I took my phone, turned on the voice recorder, and placed it on the shelf near the dining table, where she always made her calls at night. I didn't want to do it, but my heart could no longer stay calm enough to trust completely. On the second night of her trip, I played the recording. Her voice was clear, steady, speaking to someone over the phone. "Don't worry," she said. "Everything's arranged. All the documents say Widow Martha Hensley. No one suspects anything." I stopped the playback and sat still. There was no doubt left. She had erased me from her world, not just with words, but with paperwork, with identity. Outside the window, the wind swept through the maples, leaves falling in waves. I sat in the old workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood and varnish, feeling as if someone had cut away half my life. I looked at the workbench where, for decades, I had measured every millimeter and planed every edge straight. Maybe from here I'd have to start measuring my marriage again, detail by detail, crack by crack, to see when it truly broke. In the silence, the wind whispered against the walls, and I heard Martha's last line in the recording, soft but firm. "Don't worry. All the documents say Widow Martha Hensley." And I understood then the fire inside me had gone out completely, leaving only embers waiting for one gust of wind to ignite them again. The next morning, fog covered the entire surface of Laurel Creek Lake. The whole house looked as if it were sinking into a thick, pale mist, hazy and cold. I made coffee as I had for years, but when I took the first sip, I realized the bitterness was different today. It wasn't the taste of burnt beans, but the taste of suspicion. Martha still hadn't returned from her Asheville conference. Her phone was on silent, and none of my messages had been answered. On the dining table lay the black notebook where I had written Asheville Inn the night before. I opened it, and beneath that note added 2 words, "Begin now." Then I opened my laptop and logged into our joint bank account, the one I had always considered a symbol of trust between husband and wife for decades. The list of transactions appeared, familiar lines scrolling past like planks of wood I had touched 1,000 times. But one afternoon I received a bank statement, envelope delivered to my address by mistake. The printed name froze me in place. Widow Savings, Martha Hensley, deceased spouse. I thought I was seeing things. The phrase deceased spouse meant a spouse who has passed away. I opened the statement with trembling hands. The account, number, bank seal, and opening date, all valid, all less than 2 months old. I tried accessing it online, but the system flashed a warning. Restricted access. Signature verification required. I had no joint authority, no power of attorney, no listing as beneficiary. On paper, I was dead, and someone had used that to open an account in the name of my widow. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. Anger wouldn't help. It only makes the saw slip off its line. I immediately thought of Abigail Rourke, an old classmate now working as a civil and estate attorney in Asheville. We still saw each other occasionally at community events. I called her. "Abigail, I need to ask you something delicate." Her voice was calm and steady as always. "At this hour, I assume it's not about the bridge you're building, Robert. Tell me." I explained everything, every detail, keeping my tone level as if I were talking about someone else. She was silent for almost a minute before speaking. "If what you're saying is true, let me check. I can file a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, to access local civil records. It'll take a few days. But Robert, you need to brace yourself. If such a record exists, it means someone has falsified your death certificate." She added softly, as if to keep me from collapsing, "Don't act rashly. Everything can be proven in black and white. Let me handle the legal side." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. After hanging up, I sat still. Morning light streamed through the window, falling across the wooden table and highlighting the small knife mark I had touched thousands of times. I remembered the day we carved our initials there. R&M, 1978. Now, looking at those letters, they felt like 3 cuts across the same grain of wood. One wrong move, and the whole board splits apart. 3 days later, Abigail called back. Her voice was low but firm. "I have the information, Robert. You'd better sit down." I was in the workshop. The saw and planer fell silent. I sat on the stool beside my workbench, hands still smelling of wood oil. "There's a death certificate filed for a Robert L. Hensley. Date of death, June 12th, 2021. Reported by Martha Hensley, listed as spouse, widow. It's filed with the Asheville Department of Health. There's a signature and even a falsified doctor's statement." I went numb. Every word she said cut through me like a saw blade. "Abigail, are you sure it's authentic?" "I checked. It's valid in the system. They used a copy of your birth certificate and your real Social Security number. Someone submitted it directly, possibly by mail. I'll send you the scanned copy." A minute later, her email arrived. I opened the file, and the screen glowed bright. The document appeared with a familiar heading: State of North Carolina, Certificate of Death. Under full name of deceased was printed in bold: Robert Lawrence Hensley. Below that, my birth date, address, every detail correct, but the final line took my breath away: cause of death, cardiac arrest. Signed, M. Hensley, widow. I read it again and again, as if staring at my own death certificate. It was a strange feeling, not fear, but a cold numbness spreading through me, like touching wet wood freshly cut by a plane. Everything felt still, hollow, unreal. Abigail was still on the line, her voice quieter now. "Robert, you must stay calm. This is your first piece of evidence. From now on, record everything. I'll help you build a counterclaim. Don't tell anyone, not even your children, until we have more proof." I replied softly, "Thank you. I never thought I'd live to see the day I'd have to prove I'm alive." After we hung up, I stepped onto the porch. Laurel Creek shimmered under the noon sun, a mirror of impossible blue. A songbird perched on the fence, sang a few notes, then flew away. I looked at my reflection in the water, a 72-year-old man, sunburned skin, scarred hands, looking no different from the man they claimed was dead. I held the printed paper in the sunlight, the last line glowing clear: Signed, M. Hensley, widow. I brushed my fingertip across it and felt the chill seep into my skin. What I felt wasn't rage anymore, but an emptiness so deep it frightened me, like standing in a workshop staring at a split plank, can never be joined again, even though the glue, the nails, and everything else are still there. I told myself, don't rush. Let time prove who's lying. That afternoon, I locked the document in the steel drawer of my workshop beside the old hammer that's been with me half a lifetime. I knew this was only the first cut, and when wood is cut, it exposes its core. The only question left was, in that core, how much truth remains and how much deceit. On the computer screen still open, the last line blinked, as if engraving itself into my memory. Robert Hensley, deceased, signed. M. Hensley, widow. I whispered to myself, all right then, Martha. If you've signed my death, I'll make sure you see that dead man standing in daylight. 3 days after receiving the copy of my death certificate, my phone rang. The screen displayed the name Abigail Rourke. Her voice was steady, but beneath every word I could hear a thin layer of tension. Robert, I've confirmed it, she said. Your death record isn't just falsified. It has a witness signature. I tightened my grip on the phone. Who? A man named Colin Everett. He's a history lecturer at a university in Asheville. I checked. His administrative file is legitimate. There are 2 separate signatures, witness, Colin Everett, and medical certifier, A.N. Other, M.D. That name made the air around me feel heavy. I remembered, Years ago, Martha once mentioned an old colleague from her former university also, named Colin. I hadn't thought much of it then. She said he was a friend from her research group, someone she occasionally exchanged teaching materials with. I even joked, "As long as he doesn't start teaching you how to teach me." Now that joke felt like a fool's laughter echoing in an empty room. Abigail continued, "I've requested a notarized copy of the file. I'll send it to you as soon as it arrives. Robert, this is serious. They didn't just forge a signature. They're trying to erase you from the legal system. If you were to lose capacity or truly die, Martha would have full control of all assets, including your workshop." I replied quietly, "Thank you, Abigail, but don't call the police yet. I want to see everything with my own eyes before anyone interferes." After the call, I sat in the workshop for a long time. Noon light streamed through the small window, illuminating floating dust particles. Each speck fell like a silent warning. Small things, when piled high enough, can bring down a roof. I looked around, the place where I had built hundreds of wooden pieces for others, never imagining I'd one day use it to defend my own existence. I decided to begin, not with anger, but with the silence of a craftsman who measures to the millimeter. First, I installed a small camera in the workshop corner facing the back door, the one Martha always used when I wasn't home. I chose a local storage system, not connected to the internet, to avoid detection. I added an audio recorder under the workbench, hidden inside a box of screws. Everything fed into a silver cross-shaped USB drive I had soldered myself to store the data. While connecting the wires, I examined that cross closely. The silver surface was slightly tarnished with faint engraving, R&M 1976. It was the very wedding gift Martha had given me on the day we married. I remembered it vividly, the small chapel at the edge of town, filled with lavender scent and flickering candlelight. When the pastor ended the ceremony, she handed me a small box and said with a trembling voice, "Whenever you lose faith, look at this. It will remind you that all good things are kept alive by trust, not fear." And I had believed her. For nearly half a century, I wore it every time I stepped outside. Even when the workshop fire broke out in 1993, I rescued it from the ashes. But now I was using that very gift as a vessel to hold evidence against the woman who gave it to me. Life, it seems, has a cruel sense of irony. That afternoon, I plugged the cross USB into my computer and checked the setup. The first frames appeared, an empty workshop, curtains shifting with the breeze, sunlight slanting across the wooden shelves. I saved the footage and labeled the file, Project R01, Proof. Everything was now methodical, ordered, purposeful, like drafting the blueprint for the final table a craftsman would ever make. That evening I sat on the porch. The surface of Laurel Creek Lake reflected the dim golden moonlight. Frogs croaked in the distance, wind whispered through the pines, sounding like voices murmuring in secret. I thought of Abigail, the only one who knew the truth. I thought of Colin Everett, the man who signed my death warrant. And I thought of Martha, the woman who had written the word widow across my life. I opened the black notebook and wrote one more line. I'm not searching for evidence to seek revenge. I'm searching to know when I began trusting the wrong person. Night fell. In the dark workshop, the camera's small red light blinked once, like the eye of a craftsman guarding his own honor. I looked at the silver cross in my hand, the moonlight reflecting off its worn edges, casting cold rays onto the wall, and for the first time in my life, I realized light doesn't always bring peace. I set the cross down on the table, touched the faded engraving, and whispered, "Whenever you lose faith, look at it." Then I smiled sadly, "Martha, and today I see faith has broken." That night, I told Martha I had to drive to Charlotte to deliver a shipment of wooden staircases to a client. She simply said, "Okay," without another word. The way she agreed, light, effortless, Felt as if my presence or absence no longer made a difference. I packed a few clothes into a bag, started the old truck, and left as dusk began to fall. The tires crunched over the gravel road leading away from Laurel Creek Lake, the sound dry and hollow. But as the truck turned the final bend, I glanced into the rear-view mirror. The kitchen light was still on. A thin beam of yellow spilled into the backyard. I knew she was on the phone, as she had been every night lately. I drove toward Charlotte, but never reached it. After passing the low ridge, I stopped at an old gas station about 30 miles from home, turned off the engine, and waited. The plan was clear. If she believed I was far away, she would lower her guard. I sat in the cab as the minutes ticked by. Around midnight, fog began to roll in. I restarted the engine, turned the truck around, and headed back toward Laurel Creek. When I pulled into the driveway, the dashboard clock read 2:13 a.m. The entire house was dark. The night air was so still I could hear the lake water lapping gently against the wooden pier. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The faint scent of Martha's perfume lingered in the living room, but she was gone. The bedroom was empty. Her small suitcase was missing. Half her clothes were gone from the closet. On the vanity, the wedding ring she had worn for decades was no longer there. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the certainty that everything I had suspected was becoming real. I took out my phone and called Rachel, my daughter. The line rang a few times before her sleepy voice answered, "Dad? What's wrong? It's late." "Do you know where your mother went?" I asked. "Mom said you went to Florida for a delivery. She said you wouldn't be back this week." I paused for a few seconds. Florida? Over 1,000 miles away. She hadn't just lied. She had built a story that would neatly fit the idea of a husband who had simply gone away. "Rachel, did she say if she was going with anyone?" "No, I didn't ask. She just said she needed a short break. Is something wrong, Dad?" I kept my tone steady. "No, nothing's wrong. Go back to sleep, sweetheart. I just wanted to check." After hanging up, I sat in the dark. The wall clock ticked, each sound sharp and deliberate, carving deeper into my chest. I went out to the workshop, turned on the computer, and opened the camera footage from a few nights earlier. Under the dim light, the image showed Martha entering the shop at 9:58 p.m. Wearing a dark coat and holding her phone to her ear, she walked straight toward the back door, the one that led to the garage. The microphone caught a few faint seconds of audio. Her voice whispered, "I'm leaving now. They believe he's in Florida. I'll reach Asheville before sunrise." That was all. But it was enough to make everything collapse inside me. The next frame showed 10:03. She was dragging her suitcase, opening the garage door, and stepping into her silver sedan. As the car backed out, the headlights swept across the wooden sign in front of the house, revealing the words I had carved by hand: Hensley Woodcraft and Home. Since 1978. That sight clenched my chest. The woman who once helped me hang that sign was now driving away, as if all of it had been built by a man who truly was dead. I checked the timestamp, 10:05 p.m. The car headed north. In the corner of the frame, the road sign glowed faintly. Asheville, 43 miles. I paused the video, zoomed in, and took a screenshot. There was no longer any doubt. She had left in the night, lied to our daughter, and driven toward the city where the man named Colin Everett had signed my death certificate. The next morning, I brought the file to Peter, my son. He's a mechanical engineer, calm, quiet, pragmatic. As he watched the footage, his face went pale. "Dad, are you sure that's Mom?" I nodded. "You can see for yourself. It can't be anyone else." When the audio played, "They believe he's in Florida," Peter shot to his feet, stepping back, his expression stunned. "No, she lied to me too." His words fell heavy in the workshop, like a plank splitting in half. He was silent for a long time before whispering, "Maybe. Let it go, Dad. She's in her 60s. Maybe it's just a late life confusion. Let's just live peacefully. Don't make it worse." I looked at my son, my voice low and firm. Son, when a man is declared dead while still breathing, silence isn't peace. Silence is complicity. If I stay quiet now, someone could do the same to you, to your family. Truth doesn't stand upright by itself. It needs someone to hold it up, even with trembling hands. Peter said nothing more. He lowered his head and gripped my hand, for the first time in years. That afternoon, I sat again in the workshop and replayed the video. This time, I didn't look at the car or her shadow. I looked at the wooden sign in front of the house, the one where the words Hensley Woodcraft and Home, since 1978, glowed in her headlights before disappearing into the night. I reached out and touched the real sign hanging above the door, feeling each carved groove. My hands had once etched it with pride and love. Now it stood as a witness to a lie exposed in the light. In the final frame of the video, the car's headlights illuminated a roadside marker deep in the woods, white letters against black. Asheville 43 miles. I stared at it and knew that the road didn't just lead to the city. It led straight into the truth I was about to make them face. Asheville was veiled in morning fog, cold wind lashing the birch trees outside the window. I sat inside my pickup truck, parked across the street, staring at the 3-story red brick building, the Asheville Inn, the place where the name Colin Everett had appeared on the falsified death certificate signed by my wife. The old neon sign still flickered, each pulse taunting my patience. I wasn't there alone. Beside me sat attorney Abigail Rourke, an old friend and the only person I could still trust. She held a folder of notes on her lap. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, she reminded me. You have the legal right to record as long as you're one of the participants. I nodded. As long as we do everything by procedure. No confrontation, no intrusion, just the truth. I rented a small room directly facing the hotel, 2nd floor, window aligned with the row of rooms numbered 210 through 218. Abigail unpacked a miniature surveillance setup, a camera on a tripod with a zoom lens sharp enough to capture the entrance clearly. I watched her work, my hands trembling slightly. Are you sure you want to see this, Robert? She asked. I've lived in the dark long enough, Abby, I said quietly. It's time to turn on the light. At 11:27 a.m., a familiar silver sedan pulled up in front of the hotel. Martha stepped out first, wearing a gray coat and a teal scarf, the same scarf I had given her for our 40th anniversary. Then a tall, silver-haired man in a dark blazer, Colin Everett, walked around to open the trunk and lift out their luggage. They talked, smiled softly, and walked through the glass doors together. The sound of that door closing, just a soft click, echoed in my chest like the strike of a hammer. Abigail pressed record. She noted the time, then said, They've checked into room 214, just as the receptionist confirmed. Through the scope, I saw the door to rooms 214 shut. Part of me wanted to cross the street, pound on that door, demand the truth. But the other part, the one hardened by months of betrayal, held me still. I didn't need to see them in bed. I just needed to hear her own words. I opened the phone's recorder, synced it to the hallway microphone Abigail had legally arranged with the hotel, under the pretense of testing acoustic interference. The monitor displayed the live sound waves. Then came the faint noise of a closing door, footsteps, and Martha's voice, steady, unmistakable. I told them he died of heart failure, Colin. In Laurel Creek, nobody suspects a thing. A pause, then the man's voice. I still feel guilty, Martha. It's like we're building a house on sand. She laughed softly, her tone carrying a sharp chill. Stop philosophizing. I'm just taking back my life. A woman doesn't need permission from a man who's already dead. The sound cut straight through me like a blade. I turned to Abigail. She said nothing, only inhaled slowly and nodded once. Everything had been captured, legally and completely. She saved the file, time-stamped it. 11:47 a.m., Asheville Inn, room 214, and transferred a copy to the encrypted Silver Cross USB, adding a signed witness affidavit. I kept staring out the window. The wind tugged at the thin curtains, light slicing through the mist. I saw the faint silhouettes of the two of them passing by the glass, blurred, but enough for me to understand that my marriage was truly over. Not because of time, but because of betrayal carefully planned. I said nothing. I just walked into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and washed my face until the cold water burned my eyes. In the mirror, my reflection stared back, lined skin, gray hair, and in my eyes the cold gleam of a man who had just buried what he once believed eternal. I muttered, "If the fire is real, the ashes won't lie." The words came naturally like breath, because I knew from that very moment what remained of my life would no longer be revenge, but justice, forged from the ashes of trust. On the table, the silver cross-shaped USB shimmered under the pale light. Abigail closed the camera case and said quietly, "It's done, Robert. Now it's your turn." I nodded, the faintest smile crossing my lips, the kind a carpenter wears when he knows the cut has gone deep enough to finally reach the truth beneath the grain. 2 weeks after leaving Asheville, I returned to the wooden house by Laurel Creek. Everything looked the same. The scent of pine resin in the workshop, the wind threading through the maple branches outside, and the old hickory rocking chair creaking softly each night. But inside, something had changed forever. I no longer believed in peace. Martha hadn't come back. According to Rachel, she said she was staying in Asheville for a few more educational seminars. I didn't ask, and I didn't react. I simply unlocked the workshop, turned on the light, and did the only thing I had ever known to do when I lost direction: make something with my hands. For days I spoke to no one. I ate in the workshop, slept on the long bench beside the saw table. Abigail stopped by a few times, bringing coffee and bread. She didn't ask much, just set a folder on the table, a draft of the civil fraud and document forgery complaint, complete with witness statements, recordings, time-stamped photos, all admissible, all enough to take to court. I glanced through a few pages, then closed it. "I don't need court, Abby." She frowned. "What do you mean?" I spoke slowly, each word measured. "I don't need a court. I need the truth to be heard. Once, in the very place where she's been praised for teaching right and wrong." Abigail said nothing. She knew I wasn't speaking from anger, but from the resolve of a carpenter who never measures twice when the first cut is true. I reached into the drawer and took out the silver cross-shaped USB, the piece of evidence holding the recording and video from room 214. I removed the metal casing, reshaped it with a carving knife, then encased it in a shell of pink hickory, the same wood Martha and I had used to build this house. The gentle scent of the wood filled the shop, carrying memories of that spring morning in 1978, when I was young enough to believe love could be carved into wood and never fade. Now I carved that cross again, but this time, instead of prayer, it held the truth. On the wooden surface, I etched a small line by hand. Truth is heavier than wood. When the oil dried, the pinkish grain gleamed softly under the workshop light, and I felt an unfamiliar stillness inside. Not peace, just the calm of a man who has chosen his path. The following days I worked like a machine. Morning splitting boards, afternoon joining joints, evening writing everything down. Dates, evidence, Martha's words, Colin's voice. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wanted people to see and to hear. One evening, as the sun dipped and the lake glowed like molten copper, Abigail returned carrying an envelope. "This came for you." I opened it. Inside was an invitation from the Buncombe County Education Council. The embossed gold lettering at the top read, "Community Educator of the Year, honoring lifetime service." And beneath it, the name that made my hand tighten, Martha Hensley. She was about to stand under the lights, basking in applause from those who believed she embodied virtue and integrity. Abigail watched me quietly. You're planning to? I folded the invitation, slipped it into my shirt pocket, and looked out the workshop window, where sunset spilled through unfinished beams. If there's any place to speak the truth, Abby, I said, it's that ceremony. She exhaled, half anxious, half admiring. I'll prepare the legal groundwork, just in case. No need, I said, running my fingers over the wooden cross. I won't shout. I'll just open a file. That night, I sat alone in the workshop. The yellow light reflected off the tools hanging on the wall, glimmering like sleeping memories. I placed the cross USB inside a velvet box, locked it, and looked around the room, the same space that once echoed with our laughter. Now it held only the wind and the slow ticking of the wooden clock I had built myself, counting down to the moment the truth would surface. On the table, the invitation gleamed under the lamplight, gold letters bright as fire. I whispered, if there's any place to speak the truth, it's that ceremony. And as if the world had heard me, a gust from the lake stirred the curtain, softly like destiny's quiet agreement. That night, the Laurel Creek Church Hall glowed like a lighthouse in the small town. Cars lined the hill leading up to the entrance. From the window of my workshop across the lake, I could see the warm yellow lights shimmering through the maple canopy like a Christmas night. I stood still for a moment, feeling the chill of early autumn brush against my collar, a cold that warned not just of the weather, but of a turning point in my life. Inside, the hall was solemnly decorated. At the front stood a small stage draped in red carpet, and on the backdrop, the words read, Community Educator of the Year, honoring Martha Hensley. In the front rows sat familiar faces, the mayor of Buncombe County, members of the Education Council, former colleagues, and successful former students. In the third row, I saw Colin Everett in a gray suit, a small white chrysanthemum pinned to his lapel. Under the guise of being an old friend of the honoree, he smiled and shook hands with people, calm, composed, as though he had never been a witness to a monstrous lie. Abigail sat on the right side near the sound system. She had checked everything 3 times, the projector, the microphone, and the USB port. I hadn't asked her to come, but she said, a carpenter should never stand alone when he's about to fell his last tree. When I entered, a few people turned to greet me. Some shook my hand, others only nodded. I smiled faintly, forcing composure, my hand gripping the small hickory cross USB in my pocket. It felt as heavy as my entire past. Around 7 p.m., the ceremony began. Soft music played as photos appeared on the screen. Martha in her youth, surrounded by students, Martha in classrooms, Martha accepting awards. Each image, each round of applause struck like a hammer against my heart. I had once loved this woman for her devotion, and now I was about to show them how she used my trust to bury me alive. The mayor took the podium, his voice booming through the microphone. Mrs. Martha Hensley is a shining example of ethics, patience, and honesty. The words choked me with bitter irony. Then came Martha's turn. She walked, up amid a wave of applause. Her hair was neatly curled. Her pale blue dress made her look gentle and dignified, the perfect image of a devoted wife and respected teacher. She smiled, glancing across the audience. Her eyes brushed over me but did not stop. I want to thank all my colleagues, students, and friends, she began, pausing for effect, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere, and my husband, who taught me that honesty is the one thing that can never be lost. The crowd applauded, everyone except me. I stood up. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoed sharply in the sudden silence. Heads turned. Martha froze, her smile faltering. I spoke slowly, clearly. I'd like to say a few words. The mayor signaled for a staff member to bring me the microphone. I took it, thanked him softly, and stepped onto the stage. Martha retreated a step, her eyes flickering with confusion. I turned to face the audience. Hundreds of faces illuminated by stage lights, expectant and bright. I tightened my grip on the microphone and began, "My name is Robert Hensley, the lawful husband of Martha Hensley, but according to the documents filed by her in the city of Asheville, I have been dead from cardiac arrest for the past 2 years. In this town, I am her husband, the old carpenter living by Laurel Creek Lake. But in Asheville, she lives as a widow, free to travel, free to stay in hotels with a man named Colin Everett, introducing herself as a grieving wife. In other words, she declared me dead on paper to legitimize her affair." A murmur spread through the hall. Martha's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I reached into my pocket, took out the small wooden cross, and plugged it into the projector's USB port. The screen lit up. First image, the falsified death certificate. Robert Hensley, deceased. Cause, cardiac arrest. Signed, M. Hensley, widow. Then the second, Martha and Colin entering room 214 at the Asheville Inn, timestamp and hotel logo visible. Then came the audio, her voice, unmistakable. "In Asheville, I'm a widow. In Laurel Creek, I'm a wife." No one spoke. The microphone hissed, screeched once, then went silent. Some in the audience gasped, some covered their mouths, and others bowed their heads. The mayor's face flushed red. Colin Everett slipped quietly out the side door, avoiding every gaze. Martha stood frozen, one trembling hand gripping the podium. The color drained from her face as the projector light flickered over her eyes, wide, hollow, terrified. I still held the microphone. My voice was calm, not angry, just steady, like a lake before the storm. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone. I came to return the word honesty to its true meaning, and to reclaim my name, from the ink and signatures that buried me alive. The hall was silent. The stage lights dimmed. Only the wind outside and the fading projector. Beam remained, reflecting off Martha's crumpled figure as she sank into her seat, her blue dress trembling like a candle about to go out. I turned and walked off the stage. Behind me, the microphone fell, hitting the floor with a sharp, cold clang. Colin was gone. Martha sat collapsed, and that was the moment justice stepped into the light, without a judge, without a gavel, only a small wooden cross and the silence of an entire room. No one spoke. Not a sound, not a defense, not even a breath dared to break the thick silence filling the Laurel Creek Church Hall. On stage, the pale yellow light still shone on the curtain, frozen on the last image. Asheville Inn, room 214. I stood there, motionless beneath 100 stares. They looked at me not with pity, but with the stunned horror of people who had just watched a monument of virtue collapse before their eyes. Martha sat with her head bowed low, hands clasped tightly as if trying to hold on to the last fragment of dignity. The light caught the tear rolling down her cheek, glistening but powerless to wash away the stain of her lies. I drew a deep breath, lifted the microphone, and said, my voice low and deliberate, "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone." I paused, letting the words settle. I came here to live again, after being killed by lies. No one dared to applaud. No one dared to look down. Only the projector sputtered and faded, its dying hum like the last breath of a performance built on deceit. I took off the wedding ring I'd worn for 45 years. It weighed more than any plank I ever cut, and hurt more than any blade that ever touched my hand. I looked at it one last time, the old scratches, the faint impression of her fingerprint inside, then set it gently on the microphone. The sharp, metallic clang echoed through the hall. "Justice doesn't need to scream." The words rippled through the silence, reaching everyone in the room. I didn't look at Martha again. There was no need. The truth had already done its work. I turned and stepped down from the stage. As I walked past the rows of wooden seats, people who once applauded her avoided my eyes. Only Abigail rose and gave a small nod. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. That nod was enough between two people who still believed in the honesty of steady hands. I walked down the aisle, each footstep echoing in rhythm with the wall clock at the back. Tick, tock, tick, tock, the sound spreading across the hall, quiet yet thunderous inside the hearts of those who had lived too long in silence. When I pushed open the doors, the autumn night air rushed in, carrying the damp scent of fallen leaves and faint wood smoke from some distant house. The light from the hall spilled through the narrow crack, dividing the small path ahead, half in light, half in darkness. I chose the darkness, because only in the dark does one truly understand the worth of light. Behind me, I heard a chair fall, a muffled sob, but I didn't turn back. A chapter of my life had ended on that stage, along with the ring and the lies that had been exposed. The next morning, the town of Laurel Creek woke as if from a dream stripped bare. Stacks of local newspapers sat at the corner store, bold letters stretching across the front page. Educators' lie stuns Laurel Creek. People whispered in the coffee shop, at the bakery, outside the church. Some pitied, some mocked, and some looked at me with silent understanding. But I didn't need them. I only needed silence, because sometimes silence itself is the loudest thunder in a man's life. I stood by the lake, watching the ripples reflect the gray sky. The wedding ring was gone, yet its mark still pressed into my skin. I whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "Justice doesn't shout, it just waits long enough to be heard." The wind from the lake carried the echo of that night, the sound of thunder not from the sky, but from the heart of truth itself. 2 days after the ceremony at Laurel Creek Church, the town felt as if a storm had swept through, not of wind or rain, but of gossip. The Laurel Creek Gazette ran a bold headline across the front page: "Educators' Lie Stuns Community." Beneath it was a photo of Martha leaving the hall, face pale, clutching a small purse, while behind her, Colin Everett turned away. The news spread faster than wildfire. In cafes, bakeries, and farmers' markets, people whispered nonstop. She faked her husband's death to be with another man? Lord, that sounds like something out of a movie. The murmurs crept through every street, and within 3 days, the Laurel Creek High School Board released a statement. Teacher Martha Hensley has been temporarily suspended pending an investigation into allegations of fraud and professional misconduct. An emergency meeting followed. The council ordered verification of every document Martha had ever signed as a widowed citizen. When the files arrived from the Asheville Department of Vital Records, everything became clear. Her signature sat plainly on the falsified death certificate. At the same time, Colin Everett submitted his resignation to the State Education Association. He left Asheville and moved in with his son in Atlanta. The man who once stood proudly beside Martha was now just a quiet shadow. Abigail called me, her voice steady and cold, like the figures in a financial report. I forwarded all the evidence to the Financial Crimes Office. They confirmed the widow savings account at First Asheville Bank has been frozen. I nodded. How long before they release the findings? Not long, she replied. But you know, Robert, sometimes numbers do the job better than accusations. They don't lie. That line stayed with me for a long time. She was right. Truth doesn't live in tears. It lives in fingerprints, in figures, in ledgers, in the balance of an account. On the 5th day after the scandal, Rachel came to see me. She stepped into the workshop, her eyes red. She looked around the room, the scent of pink hickory still sweet in the air. Everything familiar, yet colder than before. Dad, why didn't you tell me sooner? I set down the chisel in my hand. If I had told you sooner, they'd think I was jealous. I looked up and met her eyes. Now they can only believe the truth. She sat, hands trembling. I used to think Mom was perfect. Now I don't know what to believe. You don't need to think about anything, I said softly. You just need to remember. Kindness doesn't mean blindness, and honesty, even when it comes late, is still the only way a family keeps its honor. She said nothing. A tear fell onto the wooden floor, spreading like a faint stain. My hand rested on the workbench, over the old mark where Martha and I had once carved the word home with a wood knife. Now the O had faded, leaving Eichme, a house missing the sound of breath. Later that afternoon, after Rachel left, I sat alone. The weak sunlight streamed through the window, falling across the stack of bank documents Abigail had sent. The red print at the top read, "Account status. Frozen. Fraud under investigation." I smiled faintly, not from joy, but from the quiet satisfaction of seeing the scales of justice finally begin to tilt. I didn't need to act anymore. Now the numbers would speak for me. That night, I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch, listening to the wind glide across Laurel Creek Lake. Everything was still again, but it was the stillness of consequence. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, dry, lonely, like the closing sound of a trial without a judge. The next morning, I found an envelope on my doorstep. The handwriting was familiar, slanted, the same script that had once earned my lifelong trust. "Robert, please let me see you one last time." Signed, Martha. I stared at the words for a long while, then lifted my gaze. The sun was rising over the lake, its reflection glowing against the old wooden sign out front, Hensley Woodcraft and Home, since 1978. Beneath the layer of dust, the letters still stood clear, a reminder that some things, though buried in lies, refuse to rot. I held the envelope in my hand, the paper cold, damp like wet timber after rain. "Maybe," I whispered, "this is no longer a conversation between two people, but between truth and the one who feared it." The next morning, as thin sunlight spread across the surface of Laurel Creek Lake, I sat on the wooden steps and opened the envelope Martha had left at my door. The paper was thin, its edges yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, graceful, the same gentle strokes she once used to write lessons for her students. Inside was a single page, no defense, no pleading, no excess. I read it slowly, each word carrying the weight of confession. "Robert, I don't know where to begin. Maybe with the thing I've tried hardest to forget, that you were the only person who ever trusted me without condition. I lived in the illusion of being respected, and to keep it, I killed the one person who truly respected me. Asheville made me feel seen, heard, admired, but it was all false. In Laurel Creek, I had a real husband, a real home, but I didn't dare to be real myself. When I signed that death certificate, I thought I was signing a new beginning. I didn't realize I was sentencing my own soul. If there's anything left in you, even ashes, I ask you not to blow them away. Not to save me, but so you won't have to carry my fire for the rest of your life. Martha." I sat still for a long time. Outside, sparrows chirped faintly. I stared at the page, the trembling handwriting, the faint smudges of tears. She must have written it the night before, but couldn't bring herself to knock. She had just enough courage to leave it behind and walk away. I stood and stepped into the workshop. The scent of pink hickory still lingered, mingled with pine resin. In the corner stood the long table where we once worked together, sawdust still clinging to the surface. A memory rose, the first morning after our wedding. She wore an old sweater, sweeping sawdust from the floor. I remembered her laughing, wiping her brow, saying, "The smell of wood makes you feel real, doesn't it?" That day I only smiled. Now that memory had become her final farewell. I folded the letter, walked to the iron stove in the corner, and lit a small fire. The blue flame flickered as I tossed the page in. It burned quickly, curling into fine gray ash that rose with the smoke, mingling with the scent of resin. I watched the fire, not with anger, not with love, but with the calm of someone whose inner blaze had finally gone out. "Forgiveness doesn't erase memory," I whispered. "It just stops the burning." The ashes floated upward, catching the light as they drifted through the window and dissolved into the morning air. Just then Peter stepped in. My son stood at the door watching me for a moment before asking, "Dad, what are you going to do next? About the workshop? Have you thought of changing the name?" I turned, smiling faintly, my voice rough but steady. "No, it'll still be Hensley Woodcraft. But the new sign will have one more line underneath." Peter raised an eyebrow. "What line?" I looked out toward the lake, mist curling over its surface. "Built once, rebuilt by truth." Peter said nothing. He understood. The wind from the lake drifted in, stirring the old curtain. Light fell across the wooden beams, revealing every grain, every crack, like the breath of the past being stitched back together by a craftsman's hands. I glanced at the cooled ashes in the stove and murmured a final line. "No fire burns forever if a man is brave enough to set down the match." 1 year later, autumn returned to the Laurel Creek Valley. The lake lay still as glass, mirroring the golden pines along its edge. The air carried the scent of resin and the rhythmic tapping of chisels from the workshop, the sound that had once vanished for so long, now beating again like the pulse of revival. In front of the shop, a new sign had been hung that very morning. The hand-carved letters were deep and clear, Hensley Woodcraft and Son. Son was my tribute to Peter, the boy who grew up among sawdust and now stood beside me at the workbench. Beneath it, freshly varnished wood reflected the clear blue sky. I stepped back and looked at the new sign, still the old name, but with a different soul, no longer mine alone, but belonging to those who believed justice could be rebuilt by honest hands. I no longer worked alone. Rachel came often, keeping the books, handling orders, and guiding the younger apprentices. Peter took charge of the technical work, teaching, managing the lumber stock. Every morning their laughter mingled with the scent of sawdust and polish, turning a workshop once filled with silence into a home once more. We opened a free carpentry class for young people in town, those who couldn't afford college but wanted a trade. I taught them how to measure a cut, how to listen to the tone of wood beneath the saw, and most of all, how to respect the truth of the material. "Don't try to bend the wood," I told them. "It'll break. And don't try to hide the truth. It'll break the same way." When one of them made a mistake, I didn't scold. I let them fix it so they'd learn that error is part of craft and part of growing up. One afternoon, while I was wiping the bench, Rachel brought an envelope. "You've got mail, Dad," she said with a smile. I opened it. Across the top were the words, "Community Honesty Forum, guest speaker invitation." The city council invited me to speak at their panel on the value of honesty in the modern age. I looked at the letter and smiled softly. Once someone had burned my honor with a forged signature. Now that same honor was being asked to tell its story. That evening I stayed late at the shop. The light from the kiln flickered across the walls. On the table lay the old silver cross, the one that once held the USB of evidence. I had removed the electronics long ago, keeping only the metal, letting it return to what it was meant to be, a symbol of faith. The firelight glimmered on its surface as I took a deep breath. "A person's honor can be killed by lies," I murmured, "but it can also be saved by truth." I hung the cross on the wall, right above the plaque marking the year the workshop was founded. The firelight caught the glass frame, making it glow like a small lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, soft, steady, like the breath of a past finally at peace. I stepped onto the porch. The lake reflected the sunset, where fire and water met as one, just like my life, once burned, once broken, and finally shaped, again by truth. I looked up and smiled. No more words were needed. Justice had come, not with shouting, but with the quiet of light. People often think justice is a verdict, a gavel strike, or a public trial. But sometimes, justice is simply a wooden sign remade, a hand still patient enough to hold the chisel, and a heart brave enough to tell the truth, no matter the cost. I didn't win against anyone. I only fixed what was wrong, with the same hands that once built that home. Martha lost her reputation, and I lost the woman who had been half my life. Yet within those losses, I found the one thing still worth keeping, the belief that truth still speaks. It just whispers softer than lies. Now, whenever sunlight streams into the shop, I hear the saw hum with the wind, as if reminding me, no cut is permanent if you dare to carve again. I am only a carpenter. I don't know courts or laws. But I know this. When words are used to kill a man's honor, truth will rise from the ashes to speak for him. If you've ever been wounded by deceit, humiliated for your kindness, remember, you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes justice only needs someone quiet, honest, and strong as wood that has survived the fire. Leave a single dot in the comments if you believe that truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs someone patient enough to speak for it.